Today we're going to take a look at this spectacularly elegant 1978 Cadillac Seville Elegante. The Seville Elegante was introduced for the 1978 model year as an up-level trim on the already super expensive Cadillac Seville. Cadillac Seville was introduced in 1976, that was the first year for it, as a range-topping automobile. And interestingly, it was also the smallest Cadillac in the lineup. So this was really a distinct departure from historical Cadillac philosophy where the more expensive the car was, the bigger it was. And that was really Cadillac's overall philosophy. If you got a Cadillac, the wheelbase was bigger than a Buick Olds Pontiac, top-of-the-line full-size car, bigger than a Chevrolet, significantly bigger than a Chevrolet in many cases. For example, the Cadillac Fleetwoods of the era of the 1970s had a wheelbase of 133 inches, and the Chevrolet Caprice had a wheelbase of a little over 121 inches. So you got a lot more car for your dollar, but that just didn't apply when it came to the Seville. Now, as I mentioned, the Seville was introduced in 1976, so 1978 was the third model year of the Seville, and this body style would last until 1979 before the bustleback Seville would be the replacement for it. And I think the 76 to 79 Seville is especially elegant in its overall proportion and form. It really was kind of the 1986 Ford Taurus of the era. And what do I mean by that? Well, the 86 Ford Taurus really set the styling direction for vehicles to come for the next decade plus, one might say. And you really could make an argument that that was true of the 76 Seville with its roof profile, its kind of three-box profile with a relatively stiff C-pillar, setting the styling direction not only for General Motors vehicles for the next decade, but also for competitive cars, particularly from Chrysler, like the K-Car. Even the last ones, like the Dodge Dynasty, still had that very upright C-pillar. Ford, of course, did elect to go in a different direction in the early 1980s with the Thunderbird and the Tempo, as well as the Taurus, but there were still many cars that espoused the Seville's design philosophy for many years to come. Now, one thing that we can see as we look at this dead-on front view of this 78 Seville Elegante is the grille, and kind of resembles a bit of a Rolls-Royce style grille, and I have to wonder if Cadillac took this a little bit from the Mark III as an example, and Mark IV from the Lincoln stable because it was so successful. Cadillac always had a very prominently styled grille, but it seems like they even accentuated the Rolls-Royce nature of it with that cap over top of it that said Cadillac. And, well, maybe there was a little bit to that, just really emphasizing the up-level nature of this overall front end. One other thing Cadillac always did well was integrating the license plate into the bumper and the front during this era. Some other cars, when you got the front license plate provision, they just had this stick-on bracket, but that was not true of Cadillac. They often did a nice job integrating it. You can also see the lamp monitors atop the fenders that allowed you to see through fiber optics if your turn signals, your regular headlights, and your bright lights were working. There were also lamp monitors in the headliner in the back that you could see when you stepped on the brake light, and you could see them in your rear view mirror. So kind of handy just to make sure that all your lamps were working. Now, as we rotate to the side view, we can really see the elegance and proportion of this 78 Seville Elegante. Notice that significant dash to axle that you can see. In other words, the front wheel is set pretty far forward. There's actually a relatively short overhang on the front portion of the car. Compare that with the rear overhang that's relatively large, and you get a sense for, it's almost like the cabin is pushed back from the front wheels and kind of gives it a bit of a sporty feel. It's obviously not a Jag E-Type, but it does look very handsome. And I think some of this was due to the stretched Nova chassis that the Seville was riding atop. It was stretched 3 inches to about 114 inches, and it did give it a really nice proportion overall. Then you have a pretty stiff windshield as well as the backlight. There's not a lot of rake to that windshield, and a very formal boxy upper. This would be a so-called three-box car. You clearly have 3 sections of this vehicle. The hood, which is relatively long, the midsection, and then you have the deck lid, the trunk area. And this was kind of antithetical, I would say, or completely antithetical to the fastback coupe era of the mid-60s to late 60s. It even continued into the 1970s with cars like the Torino Coupes and the Montegos that were really two-box designs. Here, this is really a distinct three-box car. Also notice how clean the midsection of this car is, and it's really in stark contrast to a vehicle like the 1967 to 70 Eldorados that seemingly have creases everywhere. That was Cadillac style, by the way, the so-called crease in the pants type styling that General Motors Vice President Bill Mitchell liked. But that body side here is very clean. There is a lower crease, and then below that crease, the body kind of tucks under. But that's really the only crease. There is another one that is higher up that's hid by the molding. But this car has a very large side section that is unadorned, very simple, and has a slight kind of concave curve to it, a slight radius. And as a consequence, this car, in comparison to the 1967 Eldorado, I would call a sharp car. It was deemed by General Motors designers as the car that really kicked off the so-called sheer look styling that would be copied on most immediately next to this, the 1977 full-size vehicles. But it's very different when you think about the creases on this car versus the creases on that 67 Eldorado, because on the 67 Eldorado, there are creases everywhere on the hood and on the sides and on the quarter panel. Here, the overall sheer nature of the styling really is denoted by the silhouette itself and not the creases that exist or frankly don't exist on the car. The silhouette is the crease. And if you kind of trace your finger around the perimeter of the car, you'll see what I mean, that it's very sharp-edged all the way up there from the cornering light and the transition to the hood. Notice this is not a perfectly flat fender. Look at that beautiful lead-in, how the fender starts a little lower and then builds upward toward the A-pillar. Again, very un-Ford-like for those who've been watching videos for a while. Ford would just have a flat fender on a car like this. Then your finger continues up the windshield at a relatively steep rake, and you notice that the roof panel is very crisp, has a very tight edge around it, especially where the roof transitions to the C-pillar and the backlight. It's not wishy-washy. It's just a very nice, crisp edge. And then similar to the hood, you have the deck lid that has this gentle slope from the backlight really to the end of the deck lid. Just like the hood, look at the gentle slope from the windshield to the front of the hood. And on the body side, you have something that was atypical for Cadillac. You have round wheel arches as opposed to the typical squircle wheel arches that adorn many other Cadillacs. Seville's never got the squircle wheel arch. I don't know why, whether it was this one or the Bustleback or even the 92 Seville. They always had round wheel arches just to make them different. And you can kind of get a hint in this side view of the taillights, which are not perfectly vertical and slim blade taillights like many Cadillacs had. These are more blocky, almost like Oldsmobile taillights, very functional, very square and kind of chunky, as opposed to light and dainty. This is almost like a designer just said, well, let's just put the taillight here, and here's a red block for it. And it works wonderfully. Then as we rotate around back, you can see those blocky taillights a little bit better. Also notice this car has a single-piece bumper aside from those little bumper guards underneath. So I guess Cadillac got to save some money. You compare that with some of the other Cadillacs of the era that had many pieces for the bumpers. But this was pretty simple execution, and it's clean as well. It looks good. And you can also see the crease in the roof as well as the sharp edge at the backlight there with the kind of C-pillar meets the deck lid, and that gentle shoulder. Notice that there's a portion of the upper portion of the doors, the front and rear doors, that kind of steps away from the glass a little bit before the concave radius surface that makes up the doors comes in beneath that and beneath the molding. What a beautifully elegant design in so many ways. Now, this view also showcases what I think is a little bit of an awkward proportion on this car, maybe the only awkward proportion, and that is the height of the deck lid. It looks, especially in the dead-on rear photo that I'm going to show you in a second, like the deck lid isn't quite tall enough. And part of the issue here is that it also impinges on the trunk space. These vehicles don't have all that large of a trunk because it's not that deep, because the fuel tank is underneath there. This has a center fuel fill. And unlike some of the Fomoco products, including Lincoln's that had the fuel tank positioned vertically behind the rear seat, you consequently have a trunk floor that's not very low and a deck lid that's not very high. So there's not a lot of room in this trunk, and it also looks a bit strange. I actually think the rear three-quarter doesn't look that bad, but the dead-on rear that we're going to take a look at does, to me, look a little bit awkward. And here, to me, is the most awkward view of this particular vehicle. It's not a bad view, but it just doesn't look quite right. I almost want the edges, the rearmost edges of the quarter panel to be pulled in a little bit so that the car kind of flares around the rear wheels. Here it's very straight, and it also appears just visually that the car is getting wider and wider as it approaches the rear of the vehicle. I don't know if it's the best look, and the deck lid just doesn't look well proportioned in terms of its overall height compared to the backlight. The backlight looks taller than the deck lid. And, again, not a horrible angle on this car, but it's just funny. One of the things that you notice as you walk around the Seville is that side profile that I showed you is so elegant, and it's set up by this overall shape. And I think just given the time that the designers had to do this car, which was very limited, this was a total rush job car that was executed in under 18 months. And I believe the designers said that this car actually was never put out on the patio outside to evaluate the design and walk around it until it was done and released, which was anathema, you can imagine, to a designer. You want to take your design out in the daylight to really see how it looks. And they were generally pleased with it. Irv Verbicki himself said there were a couple little awkward angles associated with it, but overall they were extremely pleased with what they had come up with. And you can see, particularly from that side view, and I think the front view, the front three-quarters, an elegant car. This dead-on rear, if I had to criticize one area of the vehicle, might be the only portion of the car that looks a bit awkward. But again, it sets up the side view, so it's really hard to say what to do here, aside from, like I said, maybe you kind of tailor in the edges of the quarter panel a little bit so it doesn't look like it's getting progressively fatter as the car, or at least you approach the rear of the car. Now let's turn our gaze inside here with the Seville Elegante interior. You did get a number of different things when it came to the Elegante interior over the regular Seville, as standard equipment at least. The first was that center console that you can see there that opens. That was not something that you got on the regular Seville. You just, in that case, had I guess I'll call it a 50-50 kind of split bench seat with two armrests up front. You also got perforated leather seating areas, the leather-wrapped steering wheel that you see standard, and then the door panels also had that perforated leather on them. Overall, the materials in the Seville were pretty good, I would say, especially for the area. The dash, I could kind of take it or leave it, and this is faux wood grain that is somewhat convincing. But the door panels are soft touch everywhere with carpeted lower kick panels. The leather is rich, the carpet is rich, and the seats are relatively puffy. And as a consequence, this car is not really that big on the inside. Remember, this is a Nova. That's what this started out as. So if you're a relatively tall person, I don't think you're going to find the Seville all that comfortable. It's a pretty intimate cabin. Let's take another look at this interior here. And notice those perforated leather seats, the center console. You, of course, have all the window switches there on the driver's door panel. And you have a very standard Cadillac dash. I guess Cadillac somehow rushed this dash design into place, given that the Seville was rushed overall. It's pretty impressive because somehow they perfectly mimicked the materials and feel of the larger DeVille and Fleetwood series and the Calais series here in the Seville, even with the same materials, like I said, for the instrument panel, the dual panel design with the warning lights up top there and the speedometer that's in that hooded area. So somebody was working pretty hard in overtime to execute this. And even the rear seat here wasn't a horrible place to be. You had those perforated leather seating areas, a center armrest, reading lamps. The reading lamps are also on the standard Seville. It's kind of hard to pick up here, but these cars also had an interesting door lock. It was kind of a semicircle Pac-Man looking thing that rotated when you locked and unlocked the door, as opposed to a typical slider bar or the plunger. It's that little black piece of plastic that's ahead of the ashtray on the padded door panel. Another interesting thing about the Seville was that the straps on the back of the seats here, they have the fake wood going all the way across the strap. That was not something that you had on the regular Seville, and you didn't have the light that was in the bottom of the center console either on the regular Seville. So you got a little bit more lighting and a little bit more full wood grain in addition to your perforated leather seating areas. There were also some neat little features on the Seville, one of which was this so-called illuminated entry system, where if you walked up to the car and you depressed that plunger to open the door, even while it was locked, this lamp would illuminate that would shine light on the keyhole, so you could find the keyhole a lot easier. Later Cadillacs, they'd actually illuminate the keyhole itself versus having this lamp on the underside of the door handle. But I thought it was a pretty cool execution and a nice touch, certainly very functional. Here's another little cool bit of Cadillac optional equipment, is the outside thermometer that is literally outside and embedded into the driver's side mirror. This did illuminate at night too, so you could check the outside temperature. Now under hood in this 1978 Seville Elegante, you have Cadillac's, well, not really Cadillacs, actually Oldsmobile's 350 cubic inch V8 making 170 horsepower. It did have a Cadillac-exclusive electronic multi-port fuel injection setup. That blue decal on the air cleaner actually says electronic fuel injection. So again, it was an Oldsmobile V8. Notice the oil fill cap there in the middle of the V. And clearly this is shoehorned in here. There's not a lot of room to work. You're going to get skin knuckles if you're working on this car, especially if you're trying to change spark plugs on the side with the air conditioning compressor. I don't think it's all that easy. But it made 170 horsepower. That wasn't bad for the time. This car weighed 4,200 pounds, though, so it was a pretty heavy car despite being relatively small. And went from 0 to 60 in about 12 seconds, which was neither great nor horrible for the time. It was inoffensive. These cars are relatively torquey, 270 pound-feet of torque. In 1978, you could also get the optional Oldsmobile 350 cubic inch diesel engine under hood that made around 120 horsepower and 220 pound-feet of torque. I actually owned a 1979 Cadillac Seville diesel that I will say it did deliver on the fuel economy. I averaged, I think, about 25 to 27 miles per gallon, depending on how and where I was driving it. But it was slow, about 18 seconds, 0 to 60. One of those cars that if you're on a two-lane road, you have to drop back, floor it, and then kind of build momentum to pass the vehicle. Yeah, I really enjoyed the car, though. I didn't have any problems with my diesel engine, aside from it just not having too much power. But these Oldsmobile 350 V8s in here are very, very smooth. I've driven them. They have an imperceptible idle. And they're not overly fast, but they do have great torque. You will move away from a stoplight with relative authority, and you just won't hear anything. They're absolutely silent. And I thought I'd close out with this underbody shot of this 78 Seville Elegante, so you can see that this really was a stretched Nova platform. Notice the subframe terminating. This car doesn't have a full frame. It's we'll call it unibody car. Really has a couple subframes that support the front and rear suspension. But, I have to say, when you drive one of these, they drive pretty impressively. Don't think of it as something that's going to drive like a crappy Chevy Nova. I shouldn't call it a crappy Chevy Nova, but these actually drive very well. They did have Teflon liners in between the leaves of the rear springs, and the suspensions are quiet. The cars are screwed together very well. They feel, I would say, firm and sporty. It's a very pleasant riding car, and it's, I would say, a nice experience, particularly because of the engine too, which is very, very smooth. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion of this particular 78 Seville Elegante. If you did, put a comment in the comment section, and thanks again for watching.